The pro fighter sneered at Bruce Lee, confident no one would question him. "This style won't work," he mocked, eyes scanning the room. Bruce Lee didn't reply. He didn't move at first. 7 seconds later, the room went silent. Not from chaos, not from force, but from the undeniable authority of mastery. Everyone who witnessed it, trainers, fighters, and onlookers, understood without words the weight of what they had underestimated. In that brief, flawless moment, Bruce Lee didn't just prove himself, he rewrote what it meant to be in control. The gym was quiet that morning, lit by the pale light filtering through high windows. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and the walls bore the faint stains of decades of practice, handprints, scuffs, the evidence of countless fighters who had passed through. The mats smelled faintly of sweat and dust, their edges curling in places where years of motion had left permanent marks. Bruce Lee entered without announcement. His shoes were quiet against the worn floor, his movements measured, deliberate, yet unassuming. The trainers looked up briefly but returned to their routines. He did not demand attention, and the room allowed him none. Students continued their drills, fists striking pads, the echo of leather against foam punctuating the calm. But something in his posture, the subtle alignment of shoulders, the balance of weight over the feet, drew the careful observer's eye. There was no showiness, no attempt to impress. He simply occupied the space with a quiet precision that suggested he understood it more fully than anyone else there. He moved through the room slowly, pausing only to adjust a stance or observe a sparring partner. The rhythm was unhurried. The air seemed to shift imperceptibly around him. Muscles tensed and relaxed elsewhere as if sensing his presence, even without conscious thought. No one had spoken to him yet, and yet the atmosphere had changed. There was a softness to the sound of footsteps, a decrease in careless motion. Observers would later recall that even the air itself seemed to hold its breath. He stopped near the center of the gym, just out of the way of those practicing. His eyes scanned the room without intent to challenge, simply to note. Every hand, every foot, every movement was catalogued in silence. There was no judgment, no impatience, only quiet observation. To an outsider it might have seemed like a man merely waiting, but those who watched closely could feel an underlying certainty. In the calm of the ordinary, he radiated a mastery that needed no demonstration. Even before the pro fighter arrived, the room had shifted subtly. Bruce Lee's presence was not loud, it was absolute. Like a still stone in a flowing river, the currents adjusted around him, bending subtly to acknowledge what was there. And in this quiet, unassuming environment, the stage for the inevitable confrontation was already set, not with words nor threats, but with the undeniable weight of presence. The gym, its shadows, and its echoes of past training had become a silent witness to something about to unfold, though none yet could see how entirely it would change the room in mere seconds. The door to the gym opened with a quiet thud, and a different energy entered with it. A man well known in the local fighting circles stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, confident in the way of someone accustomed to victory. His eyes swept the room casually, taking in the mats, the students, the trainers, and finally resting on Bruce Lee with a mixture of amusement and mild disdain. He laughed, softly at first, then louder, a sound meant to fill the space to assert dominance. It was not a roar of aggression, but a calculated signal. He did not feel threatened. To him, this was routine. Fighters came and went, and here was another young man, small in comparison, whose presence barely registered at first glance. The gym's other occupants felt the shift instantly. The laughter carried authority, yet it betrayed a blind spot, a presumption of superiority. Bruce Lee did not respond. He remained still, his body relaxed yet alert. His gaze met the challengers for only a fraction of a second before returning to the space around him. There was no defensiveness, no provocation. The pro fighter, sensing the lack of reaction, smiled again, this one broader, more assured. It was a gesture that said, "I know this game better than you." The challenger moved deliberately through the room, performing stretches that seemed larger, more theatrical than necessary. He flexed his arms, rolled his shoulders, shifted his stance, a silent exhibition of confidence. Students paused their practice subtly, sensing something significant was about to unfold. Trainers leaned back slightly, instinctively observing how the room's balance might tip. Bruce Lee continued to watch, not at the man directly, but at the small details, how the weight shifted in his opponent's stance, the slight patterns in his breathing, the rhythm of his footwork. There was no hurry, no overreaction. It was as if he were cataloging everything, storing it quietly, preparing for a moment that had not yet arrived. The pro fighter, unaware of the scrutiny, laughed again, louder this time, and walked to the center of the mat. He called out, half mocking, half challenging, inviting Bruce Lee to respond. The words were casual, yet carried the weight of assumed authority. Yet Bruce Lee's silence did not diminish him. In fact, it grew louder, a presence that did not argue, but simply existed, patient and unyielding. In that stillness, observers would later recall the tension as nearly tangible. The gym, once merely a space for practice, now felt like the edge of a quiet storm. No one spoke, yet every body in the room adjusted unconsciously. The laughter of the challenger faded slightly under the weight of unspoken certainty. The stage was set, not with confrontation, but with observation. In the moments before action, something subtle, almost imperceptible, had already shifted. And in that shift, the inevitability of what would happen next quietly took form, unnoticed by most, but felt by all who were present. The gym settled into an unusual quiet. It was not the absence of sound, but the alteration of it. Footfalls slowed, the slap of fists on pads softened, even the soft squeak of shoes on mats seemed to hesitate. Students who had been practicing pairs drills now stole glances, unsure whether to continue. Trainers exchanged subtle nods, sensing that something beyond ordinary sparring was unfolding. The pro fighter, unaware of the growing tension, continued his preparations. His movements were larger than necessary, a flourish of punches and kicks, stretches that extended beyond functional purpose. He was performing dominance, broadcasting confidence for anyone watching. Each gesture reinforced his assumption here was a man in control, ready to show the novice what real fighting meant. Bruce Lee remained calm. He did not mirror the display, did not attempt to match it with his own presence. Instead, he observed. His eyes traced the fighter's weight distribution, the slight tilt of his shoulders, the micro shifts in his stance with each motion. To a casual observer, Bruce Lee seemed almost idle, waiting. But those attuned to the nuances of combat recognized that observation was action in itself. He cataloged everything, silently preparing for the moment when control would be necessary. Whispers began to spread among the bystanders. Who is this kid? Is he really going to step up? He doesn't even seem to react. There was a murmur of doubt, curiosity, and unease. The challenger's confidence, once so certain, now met a subtle resistance in the form of quiet scrutiny. The gym itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that ordinary hierarchy, experience, reputation, size, might not dictate the outcome here. Every second felt heavier than the last. The students paused mid-strike, the trainers leaned slightly forward, and even those at the edges of the room could sense a shift. The tension was not loud, it did not come from anger or shouting. It was psychological, a slow, creeping awareness that the dynamics of the room had changed. The pro fighter's every confident motion was now under a lens that could, and would, expose any flaw.
Bruce Lee's silence was its own statement. He did not challenge the man verbally, did not raise a fist or adopt an aggressive stance.
The tension he generated was not external, it was an inevitable consequence of his focus and composure. Observers later described it as a quiet authority that seemed to compress time, making each heartbeat feel deliberate, each second significant. By the time the fighter stopped his warm-up, the room had shifted. The laughter that had announced his arrival had faded into an uneasy stillness. The spectators, who had entered expecting a routine display of prowess, now felt an unspoken question in the air. Could dominance be defined by presence alone, by precision and awareness rather than size and force? And in that pregnant pause, the stage for the inevitable demonstration of skill and control was fully set. The public tension had reached its quiet peak, a taut string ready to snap, though no one yet knew exactly how it would unfold. The pro fighter, still radiating confidence, shifted his stance in the center of the mat, unconsciously inviting engagement. His eyes scanned Bruce Lee again, measuring, assessing, assuming the young man would respond, would flinch, and would show some trace of nervousness, but there was nothing. Only presence, only observation. Bruce Lee did not move toward him. He did not adopt a stance of aggression, nor did he make any gesture to provoke. Instead, he stood quietly, his weight evenly distributed, his eyes calm but alert. Every subtle movement of the challenger, the micro-adjustments of his shoulders, the slight bounce in his feet, the tightening of fists, was registered with precision. Nothing escaped him. The room itself seemed to slow around his attention, as if time were bending to the rhythm of observation. The spectators watched in near silence. Students leaned forward, trainers tilted their heads, and even those at the edges of the gym felt the shift. There was no shouting, no dramatic flourish. The tension was psychological, a silent pressure building around the pro fighter. Each moment that passed without action highlighted Bruce Lee's mastery. Observation was itself a demonstration of control. The pro fighter began a slow series of shadow strikes, more to assert dominance than to engage. Bruce Lee responded with subtle shifts of his own, minimal adjustments in positioning, weight, and distance. He did not strike, did not block. He simply placed himself where the opponent's momentum could be anticipated, neutralized before it fully manifested. It was efficiency disguised as stillness, restraint disguised as passivity. Witnesses would later describe it as almost imperceptible, a glance, a subtle sidestep, a micro-adjustment that rendered the fighter's confident movements ineffective. Nothing dramatic happened, yet the result was undeniable. Control had quietly shifted. The pro fighter's initial certainty began to falter, not violently but gradually, like water slowly eroding stone.
Bruce Lee's face betrayed nothing. There was no triumph, no condescension, no outward sign of superiority. The authority he projected was not loud, it was absolute, unspoken, and undeniable.
Every observer felt it, not in fear, not in awe, but in the recognition that mastery need not announce itself. It could exist, quietly yet decisively, shaping the environment and those within it without effort. By the end of the silent observation, the room had changed. Movements that had once seemed certain were now tentative. Confidence that had arrived with a laugh had softened into hesitation. And in that stillness, the inevitability of what would come next, the brief, decisive demonstration, was already established. Bruce Lee's mastery did not need spectacle, it only needed observation. The moment arrived quietly. There was no signal, no shout, no dramatic stance. The pro fighter shifted forward slightly, a casual step meant to assert dominance. Bruce Lee responded instinctively, but not with a strike. Only a subtle adjustment of posture, a minor shift in weight, barely noticeable to anyone untrained. For 7 seconds, everything unfolded with deliberate precision. Each movement from the challenger, every lean step and swing, was anticipated, neutralized without excess effort. Bruce Lee did not collide with force, he guided, redirected, controlled. In that brief interval, the pro fighter's balance faltered, his rhythm disrupted, and his intended aggression met resistance so seamless that it was nearly invisible. The room seemed to hold its breath. Observers later described the sequence as almost imperceptible, yet completely decisive. No one could pinpoint exactly how it happened, only that the outcome was undeniable. In 7 seconds, the challenger's confidence eroded, not through pain, but through the quiet, unyielding efficiency of Bruce Lee's movements. Every shift was calculated, a slight tilt of the head, a repositioning of the foot, a barely perceptible adjustment of the center of gravity. Each motion was deliberate. To the untrained eye, it seemed as though nothing had happened. To those watching closely, every micro-movement spoke volumes. It was control distilled into its purest form, mastery without theatrics, authority without aggression. By the end of the 7 seconds, the pro fighter paused. His eyes widened with realization. He had expected confrontation, perhaps even resistance, but not this. Not a quiet, almost invisible mastery that rendered his size, reach, and previous victories irrelevant in the span of a heartbeat. The laughter, the confidence, the assumed superiority, all had dissolved into comprehension. Bruce Lee's posture remained calm, unaffected, as if he had done nothing at all. But the room knew better. Every witness sensed the shift. The challenger's dominance had been quietly overturned, the hierarchy recalibrated without spectacle or violence. The inevitability of mastery had revealed itself, and in that silence that followed, the gym itself seemed to acknowledge what had occurred. Not with noise, not with applause, but with a stillness that could not be ignored. A quiet testament to the power of restraint, precision, and observation executed to perfection. The pro fighter stood frozen, a subtle tremor in his shoulders betraying the unraveling of his confidence. It was not fear as one might expect, nor panic, nor anger. It was a quiet, creeping awareness that the assumptions he had carried into the gym had been quietly dismantled. For the first time, he confronted a reality he could not command, mastery beyond his comprehension, delivered without aggression, without spectacle, and without haste. Witnesses later described the moment as almost unbearable to watch. The fighter's initial amusement and dominance, the laughter, the smirks, the exaggerated posturing, had dissolved completely. Each breath now seemed measured, hesitant, his eyes darting not in challenge but in study, as though trying to decode a puzzle he had no hope of solving in the moment. Bruce Lee remained still, calm, eyes observing yet unreactive. Every movement of the pro fighter, every micro-shift of his weight, was catalogued silently. The authority in the room no longer belonged to the man who had entered with confidence. It belonged to the observer who required no demonstration. It was a psychological collapse executed with the same precision as a well-timed strike. There was no loud clash, no dramatic confrontation, only a shift in perception. The fighter had relied on size, reputation, and bravado. These were now irrelevant. Every principle he believed governed combat had been challenged in 7 seconds. The collapse was internal, a recalibration of ego, expectation, and understanding, witnessed quietly by those who had been present. The students in the room, though not directly involved, felt the tension radiate outward. They sensed the alteration in the gym's energy, the subtle shift of hierarchy, the undeniable power of presence combined with silent skill. Trainers observed the fighter's hesitation, noting the rare moment when experience and confidence yielded to incomprehension and humility. Bruce Lee's demeanor never changed. There was no gloating, no confirmation of superiority. The collapse was a natural consequence of his method, not a performance to impress. It was quiet, inevitable, and complete. The pro fighter's eyes, once gleaming with certainty, now reflected comprehension. Mastery was not measured in force, nor in reach, nor in history. It was measured in presence, precision, and the ability to remain fully in control while unraveling opposition without effort. And in that silence, in the subtle tension that hung in the room, everyone present recognized something profound. Victory, if it could even be called that, had occurred not with noise, nor spectacle, nor drama, but with quiet inevitability. The lesson, though unspoken, was etched deeply in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The psychological collapse was complete. The laughter and confidence that had marked the challenger's arrival were gone, replaced by the slow, steady realization of what it meant to underestimate someone who did not need to announce his authority. It simply existed. Months passed, and the incident became a quiet story told in whispers rather than shouted from the rooftops. Students who had been present recalled it not with excitement, but with reverent observation, the memory of a 7-second demonstration that had shifted perception and recalibrated understanding of mastery. Trainers would reference it in subtle lessons, never a spectacle, but as an example of efficiency, awareness, and control executed flawlessly. The pro fighter returned to the gym eventually, but his posture had changed. The confident swagger that once defined him was tempered by the memory of that brief, inescapable encounter. He no longer laughed at novices, no longer assumed that size and reach dictated outcomes. In his presence, the lesson lingered. Mastery was quiet, unassuming, and absolute. The incident had left an imprint not through force, but through inevitability. Bruce Lee continued his routines, often alone, often in observation. But the gym itself carried the echoes of that day. Students moved differently, their awareness sharpened. They watched more closely, considered more deeply, and learned that authority could be exercised without noise, without spectacle, without confrontation. The legend of the 7 seconds was not about defeating a man. It was about revealing a standard of presence and precision that would quietly influence everyone who witnessed it. Years later, those who had seen it still described it with the same calm intensity. The story persisted not as a tale of violence, but as a lesson in psychological authority, subtle mastery, and the power of restraint. Bruce Lee's influence did not come from the strikes he landed or the fights he won, but from the moments where he demonstrated control so absolute that outcomes became inevitable, even before a fist was thrown. The gym, once just a place of training, became a repository of quiet legend. Visitors heard the story not as a boast, but as an observation, a reminder that true skill was measured in awareness, timing, and the ability to shape events without forcing them. Bruce Lee's 7 seconds had transcended the moment, becoming a quiet benchmark for anyone who aspired to mastery. And in that stillness, in the long echo of those few seconds, the lesson endured. The power of observation, the efficiency of movement, and the inevitability of mastery had become a story told in silence. A story that would quietly influence generations, long after the mats were worn and the fighters had left.